Sup guys, Bjorn here, and I just finished doing my tier list for Sanctum of Domination. Now, it's pretty troll to just look at a tier list and think you know everything about the meta, think you know which classes are going to be played and not, because every single tier, it just depends on the raid comp, right? Mythic raiding is all about covering all the bases, you need all the buffs, you only have 20 spots to fill them out, and that just means that sometimes some classes aren't going to be brought even though they're good. And sometimes you just fucking class stack like 4 of the best DPS if it's really good, right? So I figured I would try to speculate a little bit of what I think would be maybe some more of the optimal mythic comps. And this is probably also going to be what I think Limit and some of the other top guilds are going to end up running in the World First race, right? Because obviously you want to optimize as much as possible. Usually the optimization is around the last bosses, right? Because those are usually the hardest ones, and you want to funnel the gear from the first bosses into the players that are actually going to be playing in the latter half of the raid. So even though these classes might be better on the last bosses and that's where you run them, you're probably going to see the same comp or about the same comp for most of the raid, right? So in terms of just checking what I've already written down here, I think this that I have down is pretty straightforward, and I would be surprised if anything's too far off here. In terms of tanks, I think you're going to be running one Brewmaster here, because monks are falling off, the debuff is probably going to be in some demand, and Brewmaster is looking pretty strong, right? So if you're not bringing a Windwalker, I think you'll be bringing a Brewmaster as your first tank. If you're bringing a Windwalker and you don't need a buff, then this is actually also not too weird in my opinion. Like you could probably bring any tank here instead of a Brewmaster if you already have the monk buff. In terms of what looks the strongest, then you might be looking at the warrior buff, you might be looking at the DH buff if you don't have any of those. If you do have those, I think any of their tanks are kind of fine, honestly. Prot Paladin might be a little squishy. And for the other tank, this is pretty interesting because my prediction is that you're going to be running both DPS Warriors and DPS Demon Hunters. In which case you won't be needing the DH or the Warrior buff for the second tank, right? So I actually think people are going to be running Guardian here, which is pretty interesting. I think Guardian's pretty tanky, it does have potential to do some really good damage. And I think it might be fit for World First progression actually. Although I might be wrong, there might just still be a Vengeance Demon Hunter here or a Warrior maybe. I'm not quite sure. In terms of if you don't need a Guardian, you don't have one, you already have one maybe. I think you can run pretty much any tank here as well. In terms of the healer meta, Holy Paladin is still going to be strong, I think. You're going to run at least one Holy Paladin, one Disc Priest, the third healer, I think is still going to be a Resto Shaman. Although there might be potential to just drop the Resto Shaman, maybe Holy Priest is looking decent, for example, or even Mistweaver. But I still think that last output healer is just going to be filled by a Resto Shaman. You'll get the Spirit Link and stuff like that. So in terms of the last healer spot, I think Holy Paladin is broken enough for you to just run 2 Holy Paladins on progression, honestly. Like, it's gonna allow you to do a lot more damage. They still do decent healing and stuff like that, right? They have Ashen, all that stuff still works. If Holy Paladin ends up being too low of a healing requirement though, I think you might end up playing a second disc or just some other like output healer. I don't really know which one. Maybe a second Resto Shaman or a Holy Priest or even maybe a Mistweaver, although I feel like the Mistweaver's not that strong, honestly. Moving on to the melee DPS, I only placed 3 melee DPS spots here because if you're running 2 Holy Paladins and 2 tanks, right, you still have 4 melee players here, and then you're gonna add another, like, what, 6 melee DPS on top of that? That's gonna be pretty yikes. Then suddenly half of your raid is in melee. I don't really like that, so I've only put 3 spots here, and then I put 3 DPS spots at the bottom where you can fill either ranged or melee, right? So in terms of the 3 guaranteed melee spots this raid, I feel like it's going to be Havoc, DK, and Warrior. Havoc for the for the buff obviously, but also Havoc is just one of the strongest, or the strongest melee probably in 9.1. I think it's going to be real good, so you're definitely running one of those at least. Then a DK for the grip for the EMC obviously, and then a warrior, because warrior's pretty strong. If you don't have the raid buff from the tank, you're going to need the shout, right? And it's just a pretty good melee DPS in general. Moving on to the ranged classes, this is where I'm very torn, honestly. Like, Priest and Boomkin is going to be busted, right? The question is the single target going to be more important, or is the AoE going to be more important, right? If you get hard stuck on Kel'Thuzad and Fate Scribe because you just need mass AoE, I feel like you're going to be bringing like 3 Boomkins maybe, actually. I think 3 Boomkins is pretty reasonable. It's really good on Fate Scribe, it's really good on Kel'Thuzad, and their single target is still like up there with the other casters, right? They do good single target on Sylvanas and Guardian too, so I think there's a high possibility you would run multiple Boomkins. The same goes for Priests. Priest is really fucking strong single target. It's going to be amazing on Sylvanas. It's probably going to be good on the other bosses. It's going to be amazing on Guardian. And there's a possibility for you to even fill this out with another Priest here maybe if you need more single target. You could also swap a Boomkin for a Priest if you need more single target. But I think that you're probably going to run at least 2 Priests, right? So now we're left with 4 DPS spots, and obviously the Warlock and the Mage are buffs, right? You need those classes. We have 4 DPS spots left. We haven't brought any of these, and honestly, I'm not sure if we would bring any of these. Like, Ret doesn't bring a whole lot compared to Havoc. Hunter doesn't bring anything. It's bad DPS. It has no raid buff. It's just straight up worse than Boomkin or Priest in my opinion. It might have a little bit more mobility, a little bit more on-demand AoE burst, you know, which is why I think you might see an MM here. It's just the slightest chance that there's an MM Hunter in the range comp. But I feel like it's probably not that likely. If it's not, then a second Mage would be pretty strong if Frost is good. If Destro is better than Frost, like, this is also really hard to predict. Is Mage or Lock gonna be better? Mage is so tanky, they have so much mobility, they have good damage profile. But Destro is also very tanky, has good damage profile. It's just not quite as mobile. And I feel like there's heavy movement on some of these fights, right? So it's pretty interesting, pretty hard to predict. My gut feeling goes towards a second Mage here. Probably. And Rets and Hunters are out in my opinion. I don't think we're going to see any of these. LA here. LA is actually possible to be run in this last spot as well. I think it could be pretty decent. So Rogue is really interesting because there is a melee DPS spot left, at least one, right? Probably a couple of melee DPS spots, maybe. And in terms of what you would run for the last melee spot, right? You have pretty much the option between Rogue and Windwalker we haven't brought yet. Then there's the option of bringing a second Havoc. And in my opinion, there's even probably an option of bringing a second DK, right? Because DKs are still going to be strong, they have grip, they have decent damage, right? There's a possibility you would bring a second DK just because they're so good defensively and utility-wise and with the AMC and everything like that. So I think there's 4 different scenarios here, right? Either single target's going to be massive. If like Sylvanas, Guardian of the first one single target, if those guys are going to try some good single target checks, then I think there's some decent chance that you would see an Assa's Rogue here as the last melee spot, because Assa's Rogue does bring some really good single target, and it is the only Rogue in the raid, right? There's still going to be maybe sometimes where having a Rogue would be pretty decent, even though they don't bring a raid buff or anything like that. Then we have Windwalker. If you don't have the Brewmaster buff, I would definitely bring Windwalker as your last melee spot, obviously, and it would still be pretty fine. But the most likely, I think, is... Oh my god, what was that? I think it's going to be a Havoc, because Havoc is the best melee overall. It has good AoE, good single target, good mobility. It's going to be good on the last 4 bosses. And it has darkness. So I would actually put my money on, if you're running 4 melees, you would rather run 2 Havocs than get a Rogue or a Windwalker. And actually the same goes for DK here. I think you would rather have 2 DKs than any of these specs. So in terms of the 4th melee spot, if you're having 4 melees, I would actually think it would be a second Havoc or a DK over Rogue and Windwalker. But it is pretty close, and if single target is going to end up being useful, you might bring a Rogue. Then, what else do we have? We have 2 DPS spots left. Could be more melee spots here. Could also be some range stuff. And this is where we're going into some more interesting discussion about the comp, because I've placed, for example, 2 Sprees here and 3 Boomkins. I don't think... I mean, there might be a comp with like 2 Mages, 2 Sprees, and 3 Boomkins, but I feel like it's pretty unlikely. You would probably rather be stacking the classes that are actually good and not bringing multiple of the Mage, for example. If the Sprees is really broken, if the single target requirement is really high, you would obviously rather have another Sprees than this Mage here. And the same goes for the Boomkins, right? If you're on an AoE fight where you just need to fucking shred with Starfall, then obviously a 4th Moonkin is going to be better than a 2nd Mage probably. So when I have like 2 Sprees, 2 Mages, and 3 Boomkins, remember that you would probably swap out like the worst of those for the best of those in any like specific fight that needs one of those classes, right? So that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to say Sprees here, for example, again, because then it's more likely that you would maybe swap out something that's bad for more Sprees if you really need them. But yeah, the last 2 spots here, I think, are still gonna go to the broken specs. I think Boomkin and Sprees are ahead enough for you to just bring those over actually taking like a Warlock, a 2nd Warlock, or even a 2nd Mage maybe, or an LA or an MM. Because they just have too much damage, and they're not squishy, like they don't have downsides. In terms of, for example, Hunter, it's really squishy too, right? It's not only that it does shit to DPS, it's way squishier than both the Boomkin and the Sprees. And while LA is pretty tanky, and it's pretty mobile, and it has some pretty good single target, it still doesn't have as good single target as these 2, and it's still not as tanky as these 2 probably. I mean, LA might be about as tanky as these 2, but still. I don't see a huge reason for you to run more LAs, but I would probably... Oh god. I would probably rather run 1 more LA. So that was my prediction for a Mythic Raidcomp for 9.1. Obviously it's not extremely specific. There's still some room to swap out some classes, obviously, and I might be completely off. Maybe you're not gonna run these many Sprees and Boomkins at all. Maybe the locks are gonna be a bit stronger than I anticipate, or the mages are gonna be stronger than I anticipate, but I'm pretty confident that Boomkin and Sprees are gonna be the top tier casters, in which case you're probably gonna bring them because they do the most damage and they're super tanky, so no real reason not to. Yeah, this is what I think, guys. So let me know in the comments if you have a different opinion, if your Raidcomps looks anything like this at all, and leave a like if you like the video. So see you in the next one, guys.